On the morning of May 11th, 1945, on the island of Luzon in the Philippines, Private John McKinney was pushed into a fight so close that the jungle itself seemed to squeeze, the distance down to nothing. And in that chaos, a Japanese soldier swung a sword and cut away part of McKinney's ear, leaving his face slick with blood just as an enemy assault began to swell toward his position. Subscribe to the channel if you want more documentary war stories told step by step, with the human detail left in, because what happened next was not a clean legend. It was a brutal, minute-by-minute struggle of survival where one man became the only barrier between a surge of attackers and the men behind him. Luzon in that final spring of the war was a place that punished every mistake. The heat pressed down like a hand. The air carried dampness that never fully left your skin. When you moved through brush, leaves slapped your sleeves and stuck to sweat, and the ground shifted underfoot with roots and soft mud. Visibility could be good for a few yards and then collapse into a wall of green, and that wall was where danger lived. You could hear insects and birds and sometimes the distant crack of rifle fire, but the most dangerous sound was often the one you did not hear at all. The quiet footstep, the branch that did not snap, the breath behind a screen of vines. The campaign itself had its own momentum. American forces were advancing, and the Japanese forces were being forced back. But being forced back did not mean they stopped fighting. In the Pacific, retreat could still be violent. A unit that could not hold a ridge might still try to bleed the enemy on the way down. A position that was lost in the morning might be counterattacked by afternoon. And in terrain like Luzon, the front line was not a neat line. It was a series of small fights connected by exhaustion. It was men moving forward, taking ground that was measured in yards, then holding it while the enemy tested the weak points. An infantry private in that environment lived a life that looked simple on paper and felt endless in the body. You moved, you paused, you listened, you watched, you moved again. You carried your weapon, your ammunition, your water, your fear, and the constant understanding that any piece of brush could hide a rifle or a blade. Sleep came in broken pieces. Food was eaten fast, often without appetite. The mind stayed half awake even when the body tried to rest, because the jungle never felt fully quiet. John McKinney was not operating in a world of cinematic clarity. He was operating in that ordinary, grinding reality where courage is not a speech. It is the decision to do your job again, and again, and again, even when you are tired, even when you are scared, even when you would rather be anywhere else on earth. He was a private, which meant he did not control the battle with maps. He controlled only what was directly in front of him, his footing, his weapon, his attention, his breath. When contact came that day, it did not arrive politely. In jungle fighting, the first warning might be a sharp crack and a puff of dirt, or a sudden shout, or the unmistakable metallic clink of something moving where it should not. Sometimes it began with a single shot. Sometimes it began with a burst. Sometimes it began with movement so close that you did not have time to ask where the enemy was. Because the enemy was already there, the fight tightened quickly. Men shouted to each other, but voices in brush do not travel cleanly. Sound bounces and dies. A word can vanish 10 steps away. In those seconds, a unit can become a set of isolated points, each one trying to keep from being swallowed. A man's world becomes the few yards he can see, and the shapes that move inside those yards decide whether he lives. At some point in that first surge of chaos, a Japanese soldier rushed close enough to use a sword. That detail matters because it tells you how compressed the distance had become. A sword is a weapon of intimidation and lethality at arm's length. It is meant to shock, to break a defender's mind, to end a fight instantly. When steel swings that close, you feel the air change. You see the flash. Your body reacts before your thoughts catch up. The blade struck McKinney's ear and cut off part of it. Blood is not a small thing when it happens on your face. It runs into your eye. It blurs the world. It makes you blink and lose the enemy for a fraction of a second. Pain spikes and the mind tries to pull you backward into yourself, to protect you by making you focus on the wound. The body wants to do the natural thing, press a hand to the injury, look down, step back, breathe. But a battlefield is not natural. It does not allow you the normal human response to injury. If you stop to cradle a wound while men are closing on you, you may die. If you fall back blindly, you may expose your side. If you raise your hands off your weapon, you may lose your only protection. McKinney did not stop. He stayed in the fight. There is a hard truth about infantry combat. The difference between living and dying is often measured in seconds of stubbornness, not grand strategy. not a perfect plan. Seconds of refusing to break when the enemy expects you to break. McKinney had just been cut by a sword. The enemy was close, and yet he continued to fight. And in doing so, he denied the attackers the psychological victory they were trying to force. The situation around him evolved fast. In a close engagement, people shift positions instinctively. Someone moves to cover a flank. Someone drops to one knee behind a stump. Someone crawls to a better angle. Someone retreats a few yards to avoid being surrounded. These shifts are necessary, but they can also open gaps. A gap is a dangerous thing in a jungle fight because an attacker can pour through it and turn a defense into a scramble. Once that happens, men begin fighting in different directions and coordination collapses. The enemy does not need to kill everyone to win. They need to create enough confusion that the defenders cannot act as one. In the minutes after the sword wound, McKinney ended up at a critical point where he was effectively alone facing an oncoming push. Whether the men near him were forced elsewhere by fire, or the line bent and thin, or visibility simply hid them, the result was the same. He was the one who had to hold a piece of ground that the enemy was trying to take. This is the moment where legend often begins. But the real moment is not a legend. It is a man alone with the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. It is the sound of movement in brush. It is the awareness that if he steps back, the enemy will step forward. And if the enemy steps forward, the men behind him will be in danger. It is the sudden realization that you are the hinge of the door, and the door is being kicked in. McKinney set himself in a defensive posture. A defensive posture in the jungle is not a bunker. It is whatever cover you can find, a fold in the earth, a tree trunk, a log, a shallow depression that hides your body from direct view. It is choosing an angle where you can see a lane of approach, because lanes are where attackers appear. It is positioning yourself so that you can fire without exposing your entire body. It is making sure you can reload without standing up. He had to do all of that while bleeding, while sweating, and while the enemy was still testing the line. The attackers came in waves. Wave does not necessarily mean a perfect formation. It means repeated rushes, groups of men pushing forward quickly, sometimes with shouting, sometimes with sudden silence, sometimes with grenades, sometimes with close-range shots. The idea is to overwhelm the defender's ability to track targets and maintain composure. A defender who panics fires too fast. A defender who fires too fast runs dry. A defender who runs dry at the wrong second gets killed. McKinney did not have the luxury of panic. He had to shoot like a man who understood that every round mattered. He had to pick targets, not spray the jungle. That discipline is not glamorous, but it is deadly. It is also exhausting, because it demands concentration in a moment when concentration is the hardest thing to maintain. The jungle fight becomes a kind of terrible arithmetic. You have a certain number of rounds. You have a certain amount of time it takes to reload. You have a certain distance the enemy can cover in a rush. If the enemy is close enough, your reload time is a death sentence unless you manage the rhythm of the fight. A good defender uses shots to slow the rush before it reaches that critical distance. A good defender forces the attackers to hesitate, to drop, to crawl, to lose the speed they need to overrun him. McKinney's fire did that. Each attacker that fell became an obstacle for the next. A body in a narrow lane forces men to step around it. Stepping around it slows the rush. Slowing the rush gives the defender more time. More time gives the defender more accuracy. Accuracy creates more bodies. The lane becomes clogged and the wave loses its momentum. But the enemy was not stupid. When a rush fails, attackers try something else. They try to draw the defender's attention. They throw a grenade to make him move. They fire from an angle to force him to look away from the main approach. They crawl to the side. They attempt to appear suddenly at close range, because close range is where even a determined defender can be surprised. McKinney had to manage multiple threats with one set of eyes and one weapon. He had to shift his position enough to avoid being fixed, but not so much that he lost the lane he was defending. He had to listen for movement, because in brush, hearing can save you when sight fails. He had to maintain the mental clarity to recognize when a rustle was wind and when it was a man. Blood continued to run from his ear. It mixed with sweat. It ran down his neck. It made his skin slick. The pain was present, but pain in battle is often secondary to the larger pressure, the pressure of immediate survival. The human body is capable of doing brutal work while injured. Adrenaline is not a myth. It is a chemical force that narrows your world and drives you forward. It also has a price, because when it fades, The body collapses into exhaustion, trembling, and delayed shock. During the fight, he could not afford to collapse. He fought for roughly 36 minutes. That is the reported duration, and it matters because it is long enough for a man's arms to ache, for his mouth to dry, for his shoulders to burn from holding a weapon at the ready, for his hands to cramp from reloading and gripping, and for his mind to begin slipping toward fatigue. In those minutes, the defender must keep his focus sharp, because the first moment of distraction could be the moment an attacker breaks through. The number of enemy killed in that span is reported as about 40, roughly in that range. In any battle, exact counting during the action is difficult. Bodies fall in brush, wounded or dragged away. Chaos destroys need accounting. But the scale is what matters. It was not a small skirmish. It was a sustained defense in which the ground in front of him became crowded with the evidence of repeated attacks that did not succeed. There's an image that helps you understand what that means, even without exaggeration. Imagine a narrow approach through brush, a slight rise, a break in the vegetation where men naturally try to move. Imagine the defender firing into that approach as shadows appear and turn into bodies, and those bodies fall and do not get back up. Imagine the next rush stumbling over the first. Imagine the defenders behind him hearing firing that does not stop, a steady rhythm that sounds like a line of rifles, when in reality it is one man refusing to let the rhythm break. That rhythm is crucial. In close combat, attackers listen as much as they look. If they hear pauses, they believe the defender is reloading or out of ammunition and they rush. If they hear steady fire, they hesitate. Hesitation kills an assault. It causes men to drop, to crawl, to lose cohesion. A defender who understands rhythm can control the psychology of the enemy. Even when outnumbered, McKinney's discipline created that control. There were likely moments in those minutes when he came close to being overrun. That is the nature of a fight like this. Even a highly disciplined defender cannot stop every approach instantly. Sometimes the enemy closes closer than you want. Sometimes you see movement from the side to late. Sometimes your weapon feels too heavy for your arms. Sometimes the noise is so loud you cannot hear the movement you need to hear. In those seconds, survival is not a plan. It is a refusal. It is a decision that you will not stop shooting until the immediate threat is gone. It is also a kind of cold fear. Not panic, cold fear. Panic is wild. Cold fear is sharp. Cold fear is the awareness that you might die and the decision to keep your hands working anyway. Cold fear is the moment you reload and you know that if you fumble, you are finished, and you force your fingers to do the work with precision even while your heart is hammering. At some point, the attack broke. That does not mean the enemy simply vanished. It means the pressure eased enough that the immediate rushes stopped. In a jungle fight, attackers might melt back into cover, pulling away, leaving the ground for the moment. They may be regrouping. They may be looking for another angle. They may be deciding that the cost is too high. They may believe they have hit a larger defense than they expected. This is another cruel feature of combat. The enemy often does not know what you really are. They see only the effect. If one man fires with discipline and shifts his position, the enemy may believe there are many. They may believe the position is supported. They may believe that pushing harder will lead them into a trap. In war, perception can be as powerful as reality. McKinney's defense created a perception of strength. When the immediate threat ended, the danger did not disappear. After a firefight, the most dangerous time can be the minutes after, when the defender relaxes too soon. A soldier who has survived a rush sometimes stands up, thinking it is over, and exposes himself to a final shot from an attacker who stayed hidden. A soldier who believes silence means safety can be killed by the enemy's patience. McKinney remained alert, wounded, exhausted, and alone. He had to hold himself together while waiting for contact with his own men to reestablish. He had to watch the brush. He had to keep his weapon ready. He had to be prepared for another rush, because the enemy had already shown a willingness to close the sword distance. When American soldiers regained the position or reached him again, they found a scene that confirmed what their ears had already suggested. The ground in front of McKinney showed the scale of the fight. The bodies, the disturbed vegetation, the scattered evidence of reloading and firing. The signs that this was not a single exchange of shots, but a sustained defense. They found McKinney alive, wounded, and still in a combat posture. It is difficult to describe what that moment feels like for the men arriving. There's relief, because he is alive. There's shock, because the scene does not match what one expects from a single defender. There is a kind of awe that is not romantic. It is heavy. It is the recognition that something extreme has happened, something that could have ended differently if the man in that position had broken. In the practical world, the next steps are immediate. Check the wound. Stop the bleeding as best as possible. Pull him to cover if the area is still threatened. Give him water if there is time. Speak to him, because sometimes a man who has fought alone for half an hour needs a voice from his own side to anchor him back into reality. But inside the private's body, another battle begins as the adrenaline fades. The hands may start to shake. The mouth may suddenly feel painfully dry. The pain may rise like a wave. A soldier may begin to feel cold even in heat. He may become quiet. He may become strangely calm. He may laugh briefly. The mind reacts in unpredictable ways to surviving something that should have killed him. Later, when the action had moved on and reports were made, the story of those minutes would be written into official language. Repelled an attack, held a position, displayed conspicuous gallantry, words designed to be respectful and precise. But the truth behind the words was raw. It was a private who had been cut by a sword, then fought alone, then killed enough attackers that the enemy withdrew. That is why it became a story remembered beyond his own unit. When a military recognizes an act like this at the highest level, it is not simply celebrating aggression. It is acknowledging that the act likely changed the outcome of a local fight, and that changing the outcome of local fights is how wars are won. A position held can prevent a breakthrough. A breakthrough prevented can save lives. And in the Pacific, where close-range assaults could be sudden and murderous, stopping an overrun mattered enormously. McKinney's action did not end the war by itself. Nothing ends a war by itself. Wars end by accumulation of ground taken, accumulation of enemy forces destroyed or neutralized, accumulation of pressure that finally breaks an opponent's ability to continue. A single stand becomes part of that accumulation, but for the men present, it was not about the grand arc. It was about that day, that slope, that brush, and the fact that a rush was stopped. In the aftermath, the story would circulate. It would be told and retold, not always with perfect detail, because stories change in the telling. Someone would emphasize the sword. Someone would emphasize the number. Someone would emphasize the length of time. But even as details drift, the core would remain. He stood alone, and he did not yield. That is the kind of story infantrymen keep, because infantrymen live with the fear of being isolated. Every patrol has the possibility of being cut off. Every movement through brush has the possibility of suddenly becoming a close fight. Knowing that someone else survived that extreme condition does something powerful to a soldier's mind. It proves that it is possible. If you imagine the fight from McKinney's perspective, you can understand why it required more than courage. It required sustained control. Many men can do one brave thing for a few seconds. Sustained control for half an hour under close assault is a different category. It is not a flash. It is endurance. Endurance has components. Physical endurance, the ability to keep your weapon up, to reload repeatedly, to move without collapsing. Mental endurance, the ability to keep making decisions, to keep tracking threats, to keep aiming rather than firing wildly. Emotional endurance, the ability to keep fear from turning into panic, to keep anger from turning into recklessness, to keep shock from turning into paralysis. MC Kinney displayed all three. The sword wound adds another dimension, humiliation and rage. A blade strike is personal. It is a violation of your space. It can trigger a fury that either helps you fight or makes you lose control. If fury makes you reckless, you die. If fury sharpens your resolve, while discipline keeps your actions precise, you become extremely dangerous to attackers. In those minutes, McKinney's fury did not break his discipline. It fed it. The jungle environment also shaped the engagement. In open terrain, a lone defender might be flanked easily or suppressed by heavy fire from a distance. In jungle, heavy fire is harder to coordinate, visibility is shorter, and attackers must close to engage effectively. That closeness can benefit a defender who is ready and disciplined, because it creates moments where targets appear suddenly and clearly enough to be engaged. It also means that attackers may bunch into natural lanes, because moving through thick brush in a wide formation is difficult. The jungle funnels human movement. Funnels create concentration. Concentration increases casualties when met by controlled fire. McKinney used that funneling effect, whether consciously or instinctively, by holding a lane and making it deadly. There is also the reality of sound. In jungle, the sound of repeated firing echoes and spreads unpredictably. Attackers may hear it as coming from multiple points. That can make them believe they face a larger force. The defender can intensify that belief by shifting positions slightly, firing from one spot, then another. Even a few feet of movement can change how sound is perceived. A lone man can sound like many. That illusion can buy time. Time is the currency of defense. As the campaign continued, McKinney's story did not replace the fear of the jungle. Nothing can, but it added a different kind of weight. It reminded his comrades that an attack can be stopped even when it comes close, even when it comes with blades, even when it comes in waves. When the war ended, the act was formally recognized with the Medal of Honor. The medal itself is a piece of metal and ribbon, but the meaning is larger. It is the nation's way of saying that this act stood out even among countless acts of courage. It is also a way of creating a public record, because acts like this can be swallowed by the enormous scale of war. Unless they are deliberately preserved, ceremonies are strange compared to combat. They are calm. They are controlled. The air is still. The uniforms are clean. The words are practiced. A medal is placed around a neck. People applaud. Cameras click. The world looks ordered. But behind the ceremony is the memory of disorder, the sweat, the blood, the close brush, the sudden sword. A man who has been in battle can stand in a ceremony and hear applause while feeling, in some quiet corner of his mind, the crack of shots and the rush of feet. That contrast can be painful. It can also feel unreal. The body remembers the jungle more strongly than it remembers the applause. If you want to tell this story in documentary form that feels true, you have to keep that contrast. You cannot paint it as a fairy tale. You have to show the fear, the exhaustion, and the ugly mechanics that made survival possible. You have to show that heroism in war is often a man doing a violent job under extreme pressure, not because he loves violence, but because the alternative is defeat. In the months after Luzon, the Pacific War moved toward its final conclusion. Other battles unfolded. Other men performed acts of bravery. Some were recognized. Many were not. The scale of the war was so massive that even extraordinary moments could vanish into the flow. But for those present, McKinney's stand did not vanish. It remained anchored to a specific day and place, May 11th, 1945, Luzon. A brief window of about 36 minutes where repeated attacks were stopped by a wounded private who refused to step back. And that is the core of it. Not slogans, not romance. Refusal. Refusal does not mean the absence of fear. It means fear is present and is ignored. It means the body wants to retreat and the mind forces it to stay. It means every natural instinct to protect a wound is overridden by the sharper instinct to protect the position. It means continuing to work, continuing to reload, continuing to aim, continuing to fire. When people hear about 40 enemies, they can turn it into a number and then move on. But if you try to imagine what those minutes look like, you can understand why it breaks the mind to picture it. It is not just the number. It is the repetition. It is the wave after wave. It is the moment when you believe the next rush will finally break through, and then it does not. It is the moment when you reload and you think, even if you do not say it, I cannot keep doing this. And then you do keep doing it, because you have to. A single defender's endurance can shape a battle in a way that is hard to see. From high-level history, history often focuses on divisions and generals, on arrows on maps, on dates and conferences. But the map moves because of moments like this, because a line holds instead of breaking, because a position remains in friendly hands. Instead of becoming a breach, McKinney's stand is a reminder that wars are decided by ordinary people pushed into extraordinary moments. The final part of the story is what happens after. After the adrenaline fades, after the fight ends, after the medics and comrades do their work, a man returns to being a man, not a defender. He has to eat, sleep, and live with memory. And war memories do not leave politely. Some men talk about them constantly. Some never talk about them at all. Some wake up at night hearing sounds that are not there. Some are quiet for years and then one smell, one heat, one sound of a sudden shout brings it back. The human mind is not designed to process repeated mortal danger and then return to normal life. Without scars, McKinney carried a visible scar, the damaged ear, but the invisible scars are the ones that shape a person's inner world. A man who has fought alone under repeated assault has learned something about himself. That is hard to explain to anyone who has not been there. He has learned how narrow the line is between order and chaos. He has learned that courage can be a mechanical thing, a set of actions performed despite terror. He has learned that survival can depend on discipline, not on strength. Those lessons do not vanish when the uniform comes off, and yet, life continues. Veterans return to families, to jobs, to ordinary responsibilities. The world around them demands normalcy. Bills must be paid. Food must be bought. People laugh, argue, marry, have children, grow old. The war becomes something that happened back then for everyone else. But for the veteran, it can remain present, not as a constant, but as a shadow that moves when the light hits it the wrong way. That is why it matters to tell the story honestly, not as propaganda, not as fantasy, as a human account of what extreme conditions can pull out of an ordinary person. McKinney did not begin that day as a symbol. He began as a private in a hard campaign in a hard environment. He ended it as a man whose refusal to yield became a recorded act of extraordinary gallantry. Between those points were minutes of fear, pain, blood, and disciplined violence that most people will never have to experience. That is the story epilogue. In the years after the war, the battlefield faded into memory for the world, but not for the men who fought there. Luzon returned to being an island of forests and fields and towns. The jungle grew back over disturbed ground. The leaves that had been shredded by gunfire were replaced by new growth. Nature does not remember battles the way humans do. It covers them. John McKinney's body did not cover it. The missing part of his ear remained. It was a small, permanent mark that did not allow him to forget that the enemy once came close enough to strike him with steel. The metal recognized what he did, but the scar reminded him what it cost. His name became part of an official record. But the meaning of that record is not simply honor. It is a reminder of the kind of moments that decide life and death in war, and of the burden carried by those who are forced into them. When people read his story decades later, they see a dramatic summary: wounded, alone, held his position, killed many attackers. But the real epilogue is quieter. A man returns from war and lives with what he has done, and what he has survived. History remembers the half hour. A veteran lives with the rest of the years, and that is the full shape of it. A day in May, a jungle lane, a sword strike, a private holding ground with discipline when being outnumbered should have meant being overrun, recognition later in calm surroundings, and then a lifetime of ordinary days, carrying a memory that never fully becomes ordinary.